I can, if you okay, if you add me as a host, I can just report it to my.
Yeah, let me do that now.
And then, but like he was like, even if figure that out, so because. And I think like I was saying, like.
It's like automatically running this big stream.
It's
I think like it's not being allowed.
A little bit. It smells more like air,
Yeah.
That's too hard, but
like air vents rather than carpet.
I.
I don't think you're
I don't know,
I mean,
it's
like-
depending on the circumstances, maybe, well,
Uniform.
I'll be able to tell, like, of course, well, I think what's in it. But like, but like, all of them.
That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Like,
I worked for before, so, well, then.
Did you find the place okay? I just
Yes.
Yes, that's and then, really, yeah, so here joined in the spirit.
It's like.
What do you?
I think there's an audio list that I
Exactly.
I'm pretty.
So it's like.
Fine.
Because it's personable, so, yeah, it's.
Always fine.
And then we're both
Stable
down.
Yeah.
I
Questions.
Like, once you want it, want. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like, everyone's, we're gonna, like, the food is getting.
Yeah,
So,
I'm gradually. If I'm not,
Yeah.
you know, it's the party was like.
Not great.
Yeah, there's actually clear, and there's one on the end as well.
I'm sorry for force. That's what go. It looks proper. I made my own, so you see it, don't check it.
Correct.
I only did it so it's.
Oh, it's really not a
But.
Oh,
I know.
Hello. Hi, I'm there.
Yes, I got it. That's friend from college. She was a forestry buttress.
That's it, here's.
I know.
Cross your.
Oh, they're terrible.
Cool.
Oh, cool. Yeah, just like.
I'm living in all kinds. I grew up as on the street.
Lindsay over here.
I thought you guys just scream to the.
Which means it's true.
I should live a long time.
No, I can believe it.
Oh, it might be. I thought you said it was a room. Oh, Ben, already. But I thought.
Yeah.
Well, good, I'm glad you're fine.
Yeah.
Maybe, did they not put their video?
Yeah.
Oh.
I feel like otherwise.
Okay. So we'll fix that.
It's free.
Yeah.
I know.
Actually, it was Flint getting through his.
Yeah. Like almost like take some steps back. Like,
Yeah, I could.
chance, and I'm talking to people.
Yeah.
It would be much.
And then they would find like, oh wait, art.
That's why we are. I'm a wall. I want to be the whole. But it's all about like that.
So many.
The chapter. So much for everything.
Yes. So.
I actually like that sounds like interviews.
I got it. I mean.
I think it sounds really. Okay. Let's put this on here. It sounds like. Okay, no, I think that's just trouble.
It's not really fun.
Oh, I love it. It's like, of course. We're just. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking of
That should be fine.
Oh, yeah.
It's like if you guys present it to me.
We need to know.
Okay, we are, we're waiting on some plates and stuff to get food going. So we're gonna be kind of a, casual working lunch. So, don't feel the need to, have a long break to get food when plates kind of come. We'll get started now, but when plates kind of come, we can grab food and kind of go, eat and chat. So we're getting some feedback. Is that?
I think it might be coming, could you turn down your
Oh,
volume?
my volume is going. That's all it.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
good.
And where is she
speaking into? There's a mic in here. Oh, perfect. It's on that.
It's on the out.
So might need to project.
Yeah, I'm just gonna check in. I told Joshua when we about 5 minutes or so to get started, but Joshua, if you're there, if you could let us know if you kind of hear us okay. Fantastic. Hello. Yeah, thank you for joining. It's so nice. I think, yeah, you're muted, but yeah, we trust that. We can hear you all right. Can we do a quick sound check?
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
You're great. Fantastic. Welcome for joining. Sharon's right here. Yeah, so we, I guess we'll kind of dive in, and the structure of this is, pretty informal. You guys have had the chapters circulated. I've let Sharon know to kind of focus a little more attention on the introduction. So I'm gonna kind of open it up for some of Sharon's questions, comments, feedback, and then Joshua to focus more on the chapter on Boots Riley. And so I'll open the floor to him when we get there. So I thought we would spend maybe about 45 minutes on each bit. We'll take a little bit of a break after the introduction, but this is really open to any questions, comments, feedback you all have as well. As much or as little as you've read, I'm really looking to, make this accessible and available to multiple kinds of readers. I've even circulated some of it among an undergraduate RA who tells me in no uncertain terms, this makes no sense. You need to define this term. So yeah, I want this to be kind of a book that, my mom can pick up and read, and anyone can kind of pick up and read and find a point of entry to. If there's any framing that it's helpful for me to offer, I'm happy to do that, but also I, can let this be kind of creative writing workshop, although accept it all with a stoic face and don't hold back as far as the criticism is. But yeah, I guess I'll open with, is there any question or any framing that anyone wants me to kind of offer for the project as a whole, where it comes from, or yeah.
I would love to hear about where the project comes from and what you're bringing together in terms of your background and discipline and all that.
Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, in terms of my training, I come from an English studies and a focus on African American literature and culture. And when I started this project, which I honestly started with a kind of reading of Beloved, the scenes of the slaughterhouse, but also the strange moments where Setha says that they treated me like I was a cow, no a goat. And I thought about Morrison as a kind of really sharp historian, and happened to, while I was at Princeton, like take a creative writing atelier with her, where she sort of talked about her process of writing as being one of entering into the mind of someone who is wholly different from you. So not in the kind of creative writing method of write what you know or write from what you know, but trying to completely use creative writing as a process of defamiliarization to your own ways of knowing. So I thought about why Morrison was both using these sort of metaphors of what it meant to be treated like a cow or a goat, which is very different in the kind of 19th century agricultural context with transformations in dairying and the kind of emergence that comes later in the century of industrial dairy extraction. So why the sort of corrective of I was treated like a goat, not a cow, to describe her memory rape. So I was interested in Morrison as someone who was very astute historian and user of metaphor. And what I tried to just kind of take seriously, so that was part of the origins of the project, was just trying to understand what Morrison was doing with squishy but also very historically attuned metaphors that related to a debased connection of Blackness with animality, but also really counterintuitive, paradoxical moments where Fetha looks at a sow who ate her in litter, kind of brazen-eyed, and that these were not incidental metaphors for Morrison. They were not historical metaphors. They were sharply incisive to transformations in what was happening both to humans and to animals, to transformations of citizenship and personhood as they were being redefined in the postbellum context, and to transformations in industrial agriculture and farming. Like, she was researching Ohio's porkopolis, telling a kind of mini history of what free labor was supposed to look like at the time. So that's the kind of like literary entry point to this project. And honestly, I started that part junior year of college, and it's kind of stuck with me in various iterations. That's some of the oldest work from the book. But then at Princeton, I also took a class with Peter Singer, and Peter Singer was honestly my entry point to animal rights work. And when I started graduate school in 2014 in St. Louis, Missouri, a week before, or the week that the Ferguson uprisings kind of happened, I saw both the division between academia and the siloing of academic work that a place like WashU was trying to kind of train me to think of academia as divorced from activism. So I thought a lot about like what integration for activist work means, and why these two activist efforts, and Sharon's book has really helped me rethink the kind of genealogy of animal studies and animal rights activism, but why often animal studies and civil rights struggles or Black liberation movements are often held apart, and what holding them apart is doing for a kind of what Sharon has described the MOVE organization is doing as a project of total liberation. So part of me is trying to like piece together a literary history and cinematic history of how Black philosophers and thinkers and writers have been wrestling with this in ways that preceded PETA, in ways that preceded Peter Singer's animal liberation. So to tell a literary and cinematic history of that, and to kind of like identify and repair the sort of seeming schism of the division of labor among activists.
That's really actually very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other framing questions that would be helpful to kind of... Okay. Yeah, so I'll kind of invite, Sharon, if there are questions, comments, feedback with the introduction that you want to get us started with, and then, you know, I'll open it up to the group too. But yeah, I wanted to give you the space first to kind of share what you wanted.
Just waiting for my comment.
That would come forward.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I first wanted to, you know, I really enjoyed reading this work. And I've actually been reading the book into the chat before, and yeah, and the introduction. And I guess my first question is about the use of the term animality. You seem in your critique, and I think that's one of the things in the manuscript that, you know, in a sense always happens with that draft, right? That first moving through, right? That I feel there's a halting in the manuscript with your critique, right? You tend to kind of not want to get messy. And animal studies is extremely messy. And I really feel, and I see, hey Joshua, I see Joshua nodding. I really feel that I want to give you license to kind of go for that critique. And some of that critique is actually of the use value of the term animality, especially as we slip from 19th to 20th century, right? And then into that contemporary film moment, right? And I find that I see that you find animality as, you know, I understand it as borrowed from kind of the European Enlightenment tradition, right? You know, as kind of less useful, that form of animal, right? Than others. And I know it's in the title, you know, of the book. And I also think that the reason why I say there's a halting way, if you're, you know, you need to inhabit your critique. And there's a critique. I mean, I wouldn't say there's a critique of Jackson waiting in the wings, because I don't think that's what your object is, but certainly the use of that. And I feel like critique can be leveled in ways that are very productive, you know, for both the person who comes before and, you know, where do you want to go? And I think, I don't know, you know, I think etching that out a bit more and spending a bit more time. It also might be productive there's a lot to cover in this introduction, to make a thinner introduction and a chapter that's not necessarily a lit review, but really where you make those turns. Because you make them so very quickly in this introduction that you, in a sense, hide your own critique to a certain degree. And also it doesn't really allow you to kind of talk about what came before in ways that are more productive. You know, and since at the end, I'm like, which conversation are you actually joining? And then in particular, you know, yeah, I'll stop there because then we're going to get to the pessimism, which, you know,
I want to hear all about it.
which is not my forte. So not my area of concentration, but I find its use value to this very huge. And I find that there's great difference among folks of black study and great argument about the utility of different critiques, right? Whether it's queer of color, whether it's pessimism, whether it's post-human, right? And I just think maybe, like I said, a chapter we really take on these very important topics. I think maybe so. I don't know if I see nodding. I don't know if other people felt persuaded.
Yeah, I mean, oh, actually, I have something on this if it's all right. I have some other stuff for the later chapter, but I
Fantastic.
feel like Sharon and I were really synced up on this because at the beginning, for me, it was mostly about pace and also about kind of certain rhythms of citational practice. So I think pretty much all the right people get in there, but I think the sequence in which we introduce the ideas is really important. So I kept thinking about, as soon as you brought in metaphor as maybe your primary device, I just started thinking about Aristotle, right? And how for Aristotle, metaphor itself, he says, is a move from genus to species, right? So I think that in the very language you're using to kind of set the argument on its feet, there's a kind of philosophical underpinning that I think is really helpful for you as either an object of critique or as a moment for you to say, this is my ensemble. because I do get a sense, and I'm thankful to be a part of the band. I feel like I know who you're with, but I do at times want to get a sense of, like, what are we interrupting? What are we kind of undermining, right? And Douglas, I mean, makes a kind of beautiful appearance, but based on the way you introduced this session right here, I'm just thinking, I want to see more Douglas at the beginning because you seem to be saying too that there's a Black prehistory to the US American animal rights movement that is largely elided, not just within mainstream history, but even in animal studies and animality studies, right? And if we're going to go to the slaughterhouse and think about Sinclair, I'm thinking about Michael Lundblad, right? Who, for some, coins animality studies in his book, The Birth of the Jungle, where he is precisely thinking about Sinclair and this figure of the jungle as it appears and reappears and haunts. Also, kind of Derrida appears, but becoming animal seems to be a kind of ghost phrase that hovers above the book. So naturally, I'm thinking about Deleuze as well, right? And where Deleuze and Guattari and their vision of, or at least I don't want to give too much credit to Deleuze, but this vision of the three ecologies, right? The kind of mind, the land, and the people, that seems very much of a piece with this fascinating figure you put before us, which is the slaughterhouse. And that kind of history of the slaughterhouse you give in the intro, to me, is where the writing absolutely came alive, right? Where you paint this vision of Chicago as a kind of stage on which this new invention comes to the forefront of the way we understand our relationship, not just to our food or to animals, but to each other, right? The slaughterhouse as a site of white racial resentment. I mean, I just thought this is a history of affect as much as anything else. So I wanted a little bit more of that sense of who are you against, who are you with, built into the intro. I'm very excited that we're going to talk about Afro pessimism in a bit because that was sort of my maybe my third big thing that I wanted to think about. Because all the AP folks, they're kind of, really interested in animals, right? Like Jared is really interested in animal studies, Zakiya Jackson, and Frank, like not just in his cow metaphor, but his idea that animality is almost always debasement. And I don't really get that from you. But if there's a utopianism in it, I want us to kind of bring that out. And I think scholars like Shay Gossett are really interesting resources to think about kind of abolition and animality because I was searching more for the abolitionist impulses in the intro, right? Like that abolitionist spirit, that sense that there's a world that's not here, but it's horizontal. It's coming. We can see it, but only in faintest traces and glimmers. And maybe the animal actually points us there. So the last person I was thinking we might want to bring into a perhaps thinner intro is John Berger, right? Who says that human beings' relationships to animals are our first metaphors, so our relationship to them is essentially metaphoric, right? That we look at a lion, literally our ancient ancestors, and we see their bravery. And so they become for us a symbolic reservoir of bravery among ourselves. I want to see like that kind of thing at the intro. Because if it's a book for your mom, which I love, that's how I think about my books, right? Like I want the family to be able to pick it up. That kind of architectonic work, I think, really facilitates that. To say this isn't a new thing. This is very, very old, what I'm arguing. I'm just making new contributions to the ancient song so we can hear it more clearly in the present. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's incredibly rich and sharp, and I'm gonna sit with a lot of that. I know have some other, questions, comments on this, but yeah, thank you, Joshua.
I mean, this feels a bit mundane because those comments were so beautiful. So I hope it's okay. Maybe I'm like, opening the door for other people to make less elegant and gorgeous comments. But I guess I wanted to say that I really agreed with Sharon's perspective that there were I loved reading this. I also felt like there were a lot of moments of sort of like hesitation where we sort of like moved on at a moment when I just wanted like a few more sentences. And then I think one question I had was about sort of following up on your introduction, I mean, the introduction to this event, not the text, but where you talked about sort of reading Toni Morrison as a kind of historian. And I guess I wanted to ask you about the set of kind of comparisons that come up in the introduction between, say, the metaphor or the analogy, the material and the historical. Because there were points in the introduction where I felt like you were kind of the kind of value you were assigning to these different I'll just say binary. I don't mean it in like, you know, it's bad use of binary, but like these comparisons, like sometimes it felt like, you know, in the section, the slaughterhouse section, like you were kind of privileging like the historical and the material over the analogical or the metaphorical, and then at other moments it felt like it was flipped. So I was curious if you could, well, I guess like my suggestion would maybe be to sort of frame the section on the slaughterhouse, which I thought was fascinating, but also there were moments where I was wondering and reading it sort of like, you know, I could imagine this introducing a book of history, like a work coming out of the discipline of history. And I feel like, of course, there are, that's not the case, and there are, you know, but I was, I guess like, I guess the question is sort of like, how are you thinking about your intervention as positioning like these different forms of comparison, like the historical tracing of kind of like cause and effect, or even just like intense resonance, versus the kind of like, you know, imaginative leap of like a human literally transforming into an animal, which is like, it's literal, but it's also not literal because it's fictional, you know. So so that's the question version, and then the kind of suggestion would be maybe to like, before you lay out this fascinating and compelling history about how, you know, the slaughterhouse is right there at all these key moments and kind of like reconstruction and beyond, to sort of situate like why it is that this subject calls for literary history and cinematic history, as opposed to say, you know, like a history of, you know, like the contact between activists and like Black liberation and animal rights.
Yeah. If no one wants to hop on, I might attempt sort of answers to all of these really rich questions, some of which I think I just have to sit with a little bit longer. But I think to just kind of Sharon's opening, which I think Josh and Arthur are both following Greta, which is, I think Michael Ludland, who you bring up, has this PMLA essay on animal studies versus animality studies. And one thing he tries to mark with that is a difference between the kind of material treatment of animals and what we think of as like the discursive register of animality studies. And I think some people have held on to, and especially if we do aesthetic studies, that the way we can kind of contact or register or interpret animals is always through the kind of aesthetic. So we trace representation, we trace language of animals, and that's how we kind of figure out what they mean for humans. Part of the focus on metaphor, I think, for this project, and the reason I kind of, you know, I want to think about Morrison as both a historian, but also a theorist who, obviously, she's not a kind of, you know, she's not reproducing a white vegan politics. That's not the goal. She's telling a kind of history of entanglement between the kind of formulation of personhood as it was negotiated at the slaughterhouse. I think she's posing a theory that kind of regards an interactive feedback loop between the metaphorical and the material. And, you know, it's it's this process of making that, when we think about the slaughterhouse, it's not just a kind of site of history. It's not just a kind of new technology. It is also a strongly, in the early 20th century, aesthetic experience for viewers that viewers were made, and Nicole Shukin has done a beautiful job kind of recounting this. Viewers were made to kind of go through the slaughterhouse line, and the propaganda material often had like a white child who was the spectator of the slaughterhouse line. Like she would be looking at the images, and because the white girl could kind of stomach them with ease, it was meant to show that immersive aesthetic experience as something that everyone should be able to kind of stomach with ease. So people would, cry in response to the pigs. They would be really overwhelmed with the stench of the slaughter. But it was an aesthetic experience primarily. Like this is, I think, really counterintuitive to how we think of the kind of exposure, the use of exposure, that if we just, show people how their meat is produced, that will create a kind of transformation. If we just like show people the horrific, that will create a kind of ethical transformation, when it's actually like this spectacle was cultivated as a kind of immersive aesthetic experience. So I think what the project kind of wants to do in thinking about the aesthetic as, the aesthetic and the literary and the visual as a register in which realism is negotiated, but also history is negotiated. And the artist that I'm kind of tracing here, Morrison is doing something quite different from Octavia Butler, so I don't want to reduce those projects. I think what Morrison is doing is restoring the history and kind of negotiating what gets turned into the aesthetic as opposed to the historical. And that is in some ways kind of a part of the movement between metaphor and material history that gets transformed into a kind of a feedback loop where the material history is meant to create certain metaphors, and then metaphors transform like how animals get used and how we think about other industries and their performance of, milking it for all it's worth, or these various idioms that kind of emerge with industrial farming that get transported onto new kind of technologies and work.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to do lunch or if you want me to go.
Yeah, did people want to take like a little break so the food is good? And Joshua, I wish we could share food with you. But yeah, get some food for kind of 10 minutes and then we can, we can eat. Okay.
The plates are very small.
Thank you
Always
so much.
fine.
We'll get back.
Use like 2 or 3.
Yeah. There are many of the areas.
Yeah, I know. I think it's good to get food while it's fresh and natural. Yeah, it's fresh and
I like that you're.
Are you?
Yeah, it's not I like that. And you should. Like, I mean, you could bring in the slaughterhouse. And it's shaped in.
I've heard
All on precedent that need. And then also it takes it. In the case of ones, like just to try to like push back and that's like legal practice.
Definitely like, I've been trying to take action. Oh, no. Like what I do is like I pick up a lot of gas, like.
Yeah, that's a good. But they're just just to like also
They're
right there.
Yeah. I don't think so. I was like, there's like, yes, that's the only night. I was like.
But like saying that and how.
Yeah.
Yeah. Metaphor kind of like the time to We're like done.
Yeah. It was good for your. It's very, that is, okay, I would say that one is great. I was just so struggling. No, it wasn't.
Yeah, and I think part of it is like the sequence, also like when do you get bored? And a lot of I do think there's like too much going on.
I like that idea. Like the idea of like a.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Like the paragraph. Interpretation. That's what I want. I want like 2 pages, like.
I also, yeah, what's your. You know, my word, but really. You know, people are, like, you know, so a lot of people, I think, are 100% wrong. You know, you're not like the best, but I think, like, you know, there's like this people do versions of the process over. They're built like yeah, you're doing it's just how it's like it's like that's awkward. Really not. That's like yeah, but like but it is that is the nature of this dimension where it's like these things are like slow. Like you know, there's a move, but there are other because like they're like we have to twice a meter. But yeah, but anyway, we can talk about also we have like infinite time. Well, that. I'm not broken. Like not unlike in English, right? Which is very surprising, right? Because
Right from the
I think there are three.
Oh, the first book. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like all of the water sounds like the whole. Yeah, it's like very. And it's very. Legal precedents on super catalyst, and then they just get like the weight.
7 hours, Sunday night. Looking at 4:30, Natasha slept 6 hours.
Like the like factors are important, but then the origins of the precedent.
Depends on the day. But I found Jenny, at 4:30.
Yeah. And then the fact that
Turned on the TV, watched the movie, and then went back to sleep for 30 minutes.
Okay.
The movie was really good. I've never seen it before. And it was a Western. Can you believe that? I just turned on the TV, like I used to watch like.
Yeah, like, I mean,
Yeah.
We're working. It's like searching for.
Yeah.
Very well.
He'll be in town for 5 years. And we want to be trying to be for ladies go. 3 people. Did you know? But they haven't been. Well, we were.
No, no. That's like just yeah, they're not doing the thing.
They'll have to know.
Yeah, so, I don't know. So, we can see this time is a little.
We know.
Even, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're in a moment, they would basically like, you wanted to. Yeah. He did get those for us hot. And he is, and it's like, I'm gonna share like, very much, like most. Regardless of. Right, you know, like. We'll be like, oh, it's like, can we ever like this ask, you know, rhythm is feminized more. I don't, anymore. So it's like, let's say, like, so I'm gonna take this back. You know, it's like, but like, the idea was like.
So.
And people kind of, and more logical, like, a lot of like, oh, it's not, you know, a lot of violence.
it's like the gorilla kind of.
Yes.
It's for like optics,
Yeah.
like a gendered optics of what the gorilla.
That's like. Well, I mean, it's not, it rhymes somehow, that's not. Not all of it, certainly not all of it. So. Okay.
So funny stuff.
But I know some hours like Serena. Maybe I was in this airport. You know,
Probably never talked
and
about.
I'm. I'll go over there. Yeah. Yeah. So it's my dollar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like there, and I think. I remember, I just remember going to Bryce. And never go, I'm not sure. So sitting in the balance like.
Ways the other day, and I. At some point, or like. Where I felt like. That's very easy.
That feels like but now I'm like, more. I hope I started. Yeah.
But I wait for that to happen.
I think it's, you know, you don't need to. I always tell them, I know, if there's like, whenever I sorry.
Same.
Well, thanks about where it's from. Like artists and that, like, sorry. God. Oh, like, sort of. Yeah. They might have just been there for. Well, no, listen, it just funny. I do remember being.
You know, it's
Well, that's just. Yeah.
Which is weird.
It's not hard. Yeah. I mean. Don't really stop.
Yeah.
You can have a go off. That's what I've heard.
Animated stuff that could be great.
I used to be huge like wander and this stuff. I've heard like that.
There are generally five to.
Okay.
So either, you know, you have friends who are a good band, they'll be posting. They'll have discussions.
Yeah.
And in that way, my friends too, that getting to see them free live show. I'm
I'm glad that's still okay.
Screenwriter, yeah, but if not, you're right.
It won't be like some program.
No.
There's probably a lot more.
Yeah. I mean,
Even the umbrella.
the city is very busy.
And they.
Right.
Okay. That's why I think.
All of that.
So those are like some of the.
Taller.
Yeah. Looking for a time with. Maybe or the caretaker. Yeah. Where, you know,
That's.
we got someone big, someone they know. Yeah, like last couple times, chicken, he was like, okay, go away. If that, you know, go ahead, find someone, find somebody who's- Actually, you know. Oh, I think, yeah. Confirming, yeah.
Really.
I'm gonna check out for other news day.
Go for music, go for the food.
One thing I wanted to.
Like Christmas Day, but it has to be this. Yeah. I think it's like something we take it around and actually try. Just kind of operate that way. Because like we're like separate. We're going to rapidly like all that. Well, when you think of it's great. We are, yes, we read whatever we read. Everyone's like the material that we do. But all the course, a lot of them, but enough that you're comfortable with that, okay, with everything. It's not that it's one.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't want them to.
Well.
I need to know more than I.
Oh, wow. Like a year before I got working. You can have stuff out like they, yeah. Electric, water. Political leaders.
A lot of. Oh.
Yeah.
The transport.
Yeah. They could increase demand from my utility to demand. Shut it off, make the grid overextended. So then they like, the grid. Like, well, if we just have like, more crypto money and I ask for a demand for it, selective to like, turn off my nerves on our next catastrophe. That's insane.
They would be like, they would increase the capacity and they would like, they would, oh, now we take that because.
Oh my God, we're seeing.
I'm on like every day. I don't think it's had there without.
The light also.
My favorite story to get it.
Oh my God.
Maybe even after this, the signal's not secure. The line feels.
Of course, yeah, but, oh, like, but, yeah, it's actually.
Trust God. Yeah.
Like,
All of our
yeah.
But I'm sure then like, I know, it might be the last, but that's not just like about like.
Yeah.
Right, like, that's just like,
Oh, yeah.
They actually say.
Which is not easy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
That's what you.
Yeah, here's a little bit of I'm getting a little bit of a lull, so I want to use that to, let people come in meeting, but, we'll get its conversation going in about a minute. So kind of reach a point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
History, and it was a long prize. This is what I'm gonna think of this. Just for you. Yeah, so we'll see. But yeah, it's pretty good.
I'm like.
Cool. Like, there's always Yeah.
That's what these here.
Yeah, just the other ones. But yeah, I mean.
Oh.
That much more.
Digging up, there are enough, there's plenty of contradictions, predicted contradictions.
You know, and then I was like, oh.
That's the
Smart. Thanks for doing the work.
It seemed like
Realize there's all these people.
Okay, the cookies have now been relocated to the table, which is typical true workshop and food mode. So yeah, I guess we'll dive back in and maybe kind of open it up to a conversation about both the introduction and the chapter. So if people have additional thoughts on the introduction, we'll shut those down. And yeah, I'll kind of I think I've wrestled with kind of the how elongated the introduction should be, and it's really helpful to hear some of you say potentially a really slim introduction that kind of sets the stage, and then creating a chapter where maybe I can go long on the heterogeneity of the kind of history of animal rights as it emerges, or the prehistory of animal rights that emerges and has been unaccounted for in the kind of writing of, from Douglas to Morrison. But yeah, this has been really helpful. I think I have some ideas for how to kind of simply restructure this, but yeah, I'll continue to, are there any other comments maybe I'll ask about the introduction people wanted to?
And it's just kind of building off of some of the other commentary about slimming that introduction and stretching in certain places. So even in that paragraph where you kind of make your argument through its wording of outrage, and then you move into your argument, it's like toward the end, it seems like you move from some really like critical interventions to critical interventions, but without stretching out exactly what your claims are. And so I think even when you hint at liberation there, I'm like, wait, this seems big. What is this? This is good, important to set the stage here because it's not going to come until 14 pages later. And so even just another paragraph there where you're really stretching the multiple in that paragraph, I think give more shine to what your interventions are here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Anything?
Yeah, one moment of kind of using Crystal's phrase of like stretching. So this is on page 24, and it's right after the section on Wilderson, and that little paragraph you have there, where you're talking about how animals reproducing confined in industrial and agricultural systems defy Marxist distinctions between freedom and slavery, life, work, production, and reproduction. As a concept, abolition demands a new framework rather than reform and progressive transformation. I was like, this is Cynthia Hartman. I feel like this would be so useful to kind of bring her in there to talk about. I mean, you bring her in later in the introduction. I was like, oh, there she is. But kind of invoking her discussion about how emancipation kind of extended the subjection of slavery as well. Could be interesting there.
Yeah, thank you. I know we had some thoughts about the Wilderson and the place of Afro-pessimism, but I want to, this is another piece of the introduction that, the project is not kind of engaged with Afro-pessimism as a theoretical project. But I'm just so like curious and weirdly mesmerized by this moment of Wilderson as I think a little symptomatic of
And to, I think Joshua's point about like the affective register of the project, like why it is that turning to the cows of industrial slaughter might generate the kind of affective pessimism. And it's in some ways it seems like a historical metaphor, but it's slightly ahistorical in that it's not trying to kind of resurrect the connection between slavery and industrialization. But I kind of struggle with like the place for Wilderson, giving too much place to Wilderson, and so I want to hear what you all think.
On the pessimism.
Yeah, or the Wilderson, or like or more pessimism.
Well, I know that Joshua put a pin in that earlier,
Yeah.
so I'm gonna let him start and I'll follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't have to be. So this is interesting. This is something I've been thinking about for a while, but haven't necessarily said in public. I think sometimes Wilderson's work becomes a stand-in for the kind of subfield of Afro-pessimism in a way we should always be trying to challenge, right? So even on kind of the question of animality, abolition, and affect, right? I think Zakiya Jackson and Jared Sexton make a really interesting triangulation. So if you bring in something like Sexton's The Social Life of Social Death, right? You triangulate that with Becoming Human, right? With Zakiya's book, and then you take this moment in Wilderson, then we maybe even have, if not a chapter, a kind of interlude, right? Because the book is a technology. You really can do whatever you want in terms of the format, right? Now for tenure, we want to have some solid chapters, right? But you can do like one funky thing, right? And if you want to have a kind of section that's a bit more stylistically and formally open, where you're engaging with Afro-pessimism and the way that it's perhaps transformed, or maybe to your mind, not sufficiently transformed, the way animality is taken up in the Black expressive tradition. I actually think that's really interesting. Part of what the cow is doing, I think, is it's supposed to be a kind of obvious symbol of our public persistent debasement, right?
Mm.
And one of the interventions of your book is that there are many other ways to think about what a cow could be doing in such a frame, right? And if you read Wilderson not as a kind of standalone figure, but alongside these other kind of Afro-pessimist thinkers, I think all sorts of other possibilities emerge, depending upon whether or not you think like Fred Moten or Hortense Spillers is an Afro-pessimist, right? Because these have been matters of contention over the past decade. You can also pull from their oeuvres, right? To think about how do animals appear like in Spillers' work in interesting ways, and for Fred too. And yeah, I just think that could be kind of funky and fun because if we're gonna have a moment of enjoyment, I think it should be to like meet people on their terms and take up their argument in kind of new and compelling ways. Because there are other ways to think about what animals are doing when they're on stage, right? Like we have hundreds of years of material where they're not just sites of debasement or moments of degradation. They're just not. There are kin, there are collaborators, and are co-conspirators in making the world new.
Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I have a couple of things very connected kind of in relation to this. First and foremost, I feel like you get so close to talking about this essentially like the food commodification of Black bodies. I mean, with especially the chapter 4, you use the word consume a lot in regards to like visual consumption, but the connection of the slaughterhouse to Black bodies is so close to like feeling, okay, the processing of their meat. And additionally, you mentioned at the beginning of this, your focus on or interest in the semen blood where she's compared to a cow, a goat, and that kind of association of the goat with the nanny instead of the more maternal figure of the cow, and how, she reiterates that her history, Stella's history of seeing her mother, the mother and the actual nanny, all of their milk being given to the white family first before being given to the Black children. So kind of just like the literal consumption of bodies and the connection to Nat Turner and what they did to him after he was alive.
Yeah.
For me, that's something first and foremost. I see the connection between slaughterhouse. It's like it's a little more.
Thank you.
I'm thinking that the Joshua's point about trying to be creative, right, in a triangulation of sorts, or trying to put works in I really like the idea of putting works in conversation with one another that aren't necessarily interested in talking. And moving through those conversations. And I just wanted to point out something at the top of 23, because I think it really gets at what we've all been saying about how you were both doing something different and then you collapse at a certain point and you stop doing that. And you don't, yeah. And at the top of 23, it says the worker demands that labor be free. The cow demands that production stop. The slave demands that production stop. And when I think about these three entities, I actually don't think of them as similar at all. I think worker has a different demand. I think the cow has a different demand that we cannot, we cannot see because we never flip around. Yeah. Right. Like the idea of, the cows in the wild. I said, well, maybe to you. Or the cow is domesticated. I said, maybe to you. The slave demands that production stop. And so what I wanted to say is it's the difference between being marked as a slave and being marked for death. And I think that those different, exactly. Right? And this is why the pessimism is so important, because there are very different arguments in Black study about what I just said. Yeah. Right. In many ways, if you look at abolition work that's surrounding the prison industrial complex, obviously abolition is about understanding that a life sentence is a death sentence, right? So there is no fundamental difference between a death penalty and a life sentence, right? So reorganizing that connection, right? But at the same time, being marked for death in the social, being marked for death physically, right? As a different kind of commodity, it's interesting to me here. And I think this is a moment where you might, instead of trying, to launch the critique isn't always to dissolve the contradiction. To launch the critique here is to blow it up and to say, right here is a space in this book I cannot get past. No argument is credible without it. So here are the parts, and I do this in my work. Here's the parts. Have a nice day. That's about all I can give you right now. And I love those moments where writers actually Toni Morrison does it all the time, where writers just let us go about our own business, right? And so I feel like right here on the 23, since this is also that kind of nexus in your work, because interestingly enough, you say condensed Wilderson content. So it's like, to me, a flag that you're worried about the relationship with that. So go into the space of that worry and worry it. Take some time to free write, what your real opinion is. You can always slash out the mean things. That's ridiculous, the margins of Derrida always are filled with, that's ridiculous. And then you're like, yeah, but I kind of like it. I kind of like it. Makes me feel good in some way, shape, or form. So anyway, I feel like here, they're not the same. There's no comparison. There are comparisons. It's messy. You say this seems a key distinction between the conditions of work and the conditions of slavery, but I keep thinking, for who is working? Yeah. And I keep thinking also, obviously, of Sexton's work and Iko Day's critique of that work, which sometimes holds in many ways, and also sometimes has this problem because we cannot conceptualize the vantage point of the animal who is not. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know what others think. It just struck me.
Oh, that's right.
Oh no, I'm just affirming from the pews. Keep going.
Another point. It's kind of the same point I made before, but about the kind of like hesitation or tentativeness. When you described Wilderson's comment for us historical a few minutes ago, it made me wonder. Like I feel like there's this tension here where it's ahistorical. You say that it's ahistorical and how it doesn't account for the material connection. but metaphors are also historical. Like,
Yeah.
it's making me think of multi-directional memory, which I know you know very well, Michael Rothberg. And, you know, the analogy between decolonization or colonialism and Holocaust, there may be historical continuities that can be traced in, say, like a material or literal or direct way. But there's also just like the kind of force of rhetoric and like the fact of a comparison being made by activists. That is historic. That is historical as well, even if it's not like, you know, for example, like you know, Nazis using chattel slavery as a blueprint. Like that you can say maybe that's like a more material connection or something. But just like the kind of like the work of creating these rhetorical frameworks. Like I guess I feel like that is a powerful part of how you describe the like feedback between language, literature, and activism and history. But then I think there are moments of hesitation, which I totally understand, because it's like, you know, it feels more solid to say like, well, we can draw a direct line. Sometimes we can't, but the leap of the metaphor, you know, the gap between the two things that are not identical, and maybe not even continuous, like I feel like maybe I'd be curious to see like lean in a little bit more to that.
Yeah, and yeah, I think staying with the trouble or the problem, as Sharon is calling Amina do, to not neatly resolve what the imaginative leap is that I guess Wilderson, but Sexton and yeah, and obviously like Orlando Patterson on Social Death, like I need to sort of stay with what it is that imagine, like what metaphor is doing in the creation of those kind of imaginative leaps that are trying to reach a history for Wilderson, and doing so through the kind of circuit of metaphor. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I just want to say one quick thing.
Yeah.
I do believe that the drive toward resolution is also fueled by a particular mode of thinking about Black study that shows up on 26, where you say, you know, where you're talking about Taviano's Afrofabulation, which was acts of creation with the potential to create polity moralities that transform the social and political world. And also, I mean, you know, I think this work is fabulous. And this is not about the work. This is about the intent, right? Or this is about what it says about Black bodies' ability. And I feel there's a lot of pressure on the Black body to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
And I want us to also find the ways in which we fail or are not interested in transformation, right? Which is also the work of working with animals, you know, who with not even animals. If you let go of this potentiality for greatness, you know, and actually have Blackness inhabit its whole being, you will find rifts and sutures and other points of reflection that provide richer. And I think Joshua's work, if I can say this, has really demonstrates really well how those moments of both, you know, where this is working and where humans fail to see, in thinking about that metaphoric relationship, and they're subtle, right? And I think Kwashi's work, which I don't see here, but I think needs to be here in many ways, opens up that possibility, because those modes of living are not necessarily positive. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I want us to get that overcoming narrative is still part of the animal study rubric, and it's in the shadows. You know, the Heideggerian urge is always already there. It's white supremacy at its best, right? The moving toward perfection. So you know, I tend to see it a lot, and I'm always suspicious because I don't want to work that hard. So never had a disability person to do much of anything. Yeah, except for what I want to do when I want to do it, if I'm lucky, right? So anyway, I don't know what others think about that, but I think it might be affecting
Yeah,
your wanting to type in something.
yeah, the analytic neatness is, yeah, symptomatic, I think, of a particular kind of reading strategy, but yeah.
Sometimes Black folks don't escape.
Yeah,
Toni Morrison gave us that interiority.
thank you.
Yeah. And also, and thank you for that, Sharon. I appreciate that a lot. And also, I mean, you got me thinking about this conversation that Sadia Hartman and Fred Moten had several years ago at Duke, where called the Black Outdoors, right? And there's this
Right.
moment where Fred says that escape is an activity, not an achievement, right? You don't ever get escaped, right? Like the thing that's pursuing you is always on you. And so part of what I wanted to say about this beautiful writing you shared with us is I want you to linger, and this is tough, but with the full weight of the metaphor of the slaughterhouse sometimes, right? Because it's the power of the metaphor itself is that it's this series of brutal mechanisms through which one thing becomes another, right? And I think that is part of maybe why you've chosen this metaphor and part of why so many of the Black studies thinkers you're invoking choose the animal as a metaphor. It's because it's this vexed sight. Like, I don't think it's an accident that it's the obsession of all these different thinkers where they're trying to talk about the kind of Black life and abjection. Like, there's something about the animal. I mean, Sharon just talked about shadows. Like, it haunts us. Like, it's always there, like a kind of diegetic music. And part of why I keep pointing to some of these thinkers is I think there's resources there. You know, in 1873, Douglass gives this speech in Agriculture and Black Progress about working next to horses and feeling this kind of moral responsibility for them because he knows that they're complex beings, right? That have kind of inner workings that are denied. That's a very vexed relationship. That's very messy. That's a messy thing to say in public, and it's a very complicated thing to mean. And I think if as a field, for me, the highest aspirations of what, you know, some of the people in that room and what I hope to do is we're going to say we're going to linger in that space of vexation and difficulty and messiness and speak to the truth of what we know, right? Which is that these animals, these creatures, they're not just meat. They're not made for us. There's an opacity there that we have to linger with and make some sense of. And if I could say something quickly too about chapter 4, if that's all right.
Yeah.
The Equisapien, right? So I saw that movie. I was at a screening in LA with Boots there. It was a little wild. Lakeith Stanfield with the costume. It was a very strange experience. But part of what I was thinking, even in that moment, is the Equisapien is such a powerful riff on terms we already have. Because they're basically centaurs, right? But it's flipped. Like Boots takes away their face. So he gives us the horse's face and a ostensibly, you know, human body. And in doing that, there's this like Levinasian thing that happens where the call to ethical relation is gone because he takes away the human face. And I just think there's something there that's really powerful, maybe that I wanted to hear more about and think more about. That we have these kind of human animal hybrids throughout the history of our species, right? We have angels, right? We have centaurs, we have satyrs, and he introduces the Equisapien into that ensemble through the most brutal means possible, or one of them. And I just wanted to hear more about that. Like you're thinking about human animal hybrids and because that I think is also at the core of our questions. Like, how do we name this unnameable kind of fusion, this collision, and have it be anything other than terrifying?
Mhm. Yeah, the centaur is, and I'm realizing now I haven't actually named that as one kind of human man combination that has this tie to Indigenous Americans, and the kind of myth of, I mean, the centaur's like hypersexuality and the myth that we get even in something like Harry Potter and carrying off on a bridge, that kind of invocation of the Equisapien as like a perpetrator of rape that was very much tied to a kind of like imagining of Indigenous Americans. I think it's interesting, and I think you're absolutely right that Riley is invoking that and flipping it, in that we're not meant to kind of see the human face and register or read the human face as a site of similitude. And I think Riley, and this is sort of what I'm still working through, is the sonic register becomes the kind of vehicle of similitude. And in some ways he's suggesting that like vision is suspect. And I think this is how the kind of surrealist techniques of the film work, is there are all of these kind of disjunctures between, you know, the sound and the image is not synced up. And this was, I mean, this is obviously like it goes back to the kind of early cinematic history of surrealism, where silent cinema was the kind of surrealist realm. And there's this great book that Arthur recently recommended, Zoological Surrealism, that's all about kind of anxieties about what happens to a cinematic reading when sound and image get synced up. And for a lot of silent documentary films about, you know, an octopus, having a voiceover narration kind of makes the reading of the image singular, or it makes it register in sort of a singular way. So I think kind of what Riley is doing is all of these moments of weirdness that precede the emergence of the Equisapiens are meant to kind of disorient sound from sight, and that the sonic ultimately, and this may be where his kind of, you know, training as a rap artist or a musician comes through, is that sound becomes a kind of stronger anchoring mechanism than sight. And I don't know that I quite know where to land that, but I think, yeah, it's the centaur and the flipping here, I think, is meant to kind of not give us a point of identification with the human face. Yeah. Maybe we'll jump to the, yeah, Jordan.
Yeah, I just wanted to continue on with the notion of like bringing more consideration of the hybrid into this work. The notion of the hybrid is very connected to the earlier version of post-human, which is more mongrelized and degraded, and just the connection of hybridity as a term in consideration for black-white mix versus, you know, like the catalyzed term, cattle-like terms for like quadroon, octoroon, is the very careful like measuring of how human versus how inhuman an individual is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things Riley is giving us is not kind of absolute states of hybridity or human or animality, but also the kind of movements that he shows Cash kind of like actually transforming, that we get the process. So yeah, I think there's like a lot to wrestle with this figure that Riley's giving us. Yeah.
I also think about just in terms of what an actual horse's vision is. And you know, when any other questions, when you're working a horse or when you're in a relationship with a horse, you know, the relationship, how do I describe it? When you to move a horse's neck, you know, so that they move forward with their head is down, is to take away their vision. Clearly, it's so when you're riding, the connection is through their back, not through their sight. They are entrusting their sight to you. And so the beauty of going around a course, my favorite was cross country. It's where I'm not in North Carolina. And when you rise up off the ground, that's when the horse takes a jump and knows what it's doing, but your leg on the horse is what's motivating. And then they're responsible. You're looking, the minute they jump, you're looking at the next jump, because the turn of your head is something they can sense as well. So the connection is completely not necessarily about vision, but a combined vision. I think that comes in at certain moments, and the best riders, you know, And both of the writers and horses, both of them being athletes, connect through the scene. And so this idea of changing the vision there is something that's really interesting to me, because in many ways, in my mind, it's no longer a horse, I think you're right, but it's in a more human face, not a more horse face. Because of that change, which folks wouldn't know if you want to write it, but I do a little cheat for you there. And there's somebody, if you want to connect with some Black writers, to ask them about it. Anastasia Crowworth at University of Kentucky is a fabulous, I think she's in that. I don't think she does, she might do eventing. I think she's cross country. I don't think she does cross country, sorry. I think she's hunter jumper. But she's on Instagram, on the IG.
Okay.
Look her up, send her a thing.
A reason to get back on it.
Yeah, and I know her. So just tell her I sent you her way to ask you specific questions about writing.
Yeah.
Because that's what writers love about the being there. That's that once you get that fine tuned, you feel like you're almost anything together. And when that falls apart, it's also catastrophic. Because you can't do a thing.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, great, George.
Yeah. This is maybe not too interesting to you, I don't know. But we were like a meat judging teams and the competitions.
Like for 4-H kind of things, or
Yeah, essentially they'll have like a butchered cow and be given the task to come up like in a spectacle go on to assess the quality of this piece of beef. And that's something I would think about. Yeah.
Yeah.
The county fair.
I know, I need to go. I have to.
I've been trying to get you to go to state fair for years.
You'll have too many corn dogs or butter fried. But by the time you get there, you'll be drunk. Other things.
This is just a terminology question, and we did all over there, you just didn't see it, because I didn't finish the chat before.
Yeah.
But I'm listening to the most recent comments by Sharon, and like, in part, the comments about like hybridity, like, centaur and otherwise. And then also the Douglas piece, the comparisons, those metaphors.
Sorry, what piece?
The Douglas.
Oh, yeah.
Is the word fusion a term that is highly active here? And like, if not, why? Because I think of how it can serve the ways that you're talking about hybridity in terms of metaphor, and also in some of the actual kind of that intimacy that's a kind of fusion that Sharon was just describing. So I wonder what that term might do for you, or if there's a reason that that's not a term, or ways that term is problematic, right? Like, or also, I don't want to say icky, but there's another word that I mechanical. I don't know, but I'm thinking about how that term might be useful if that's not a term that you're wrestling.
Yeah, fusion. I mean, because in some ways, like what Sharon described with writing and the kind of like communication of movement that happens in a kind of interactive and collaborative way, where you become like the vision for the horse and the horse becomes like the movement. That's quite different from the kind of like extractive uses of the Equisapien. So fusion, it seems like part of what is kind of cut off, or in the film's vision of the kind of single use of the Equisapiens for body parts, or like reducing them to strength and stamina to load boxes or move gadgets from one point to another, is it's not collaborative. It's not kind of drawing in relative strengths in the way that something like writing seems to be in this description. So I haven't thought about fusion, and I don't know if the term that comes up, is there like a tradition of the term that like seems?
I feel like there's something that might cohere these different relationships. One that seems like we need a deep intimacy, and the other maybe not, right? So intimacy also feels like a word that belongs here. Some of the relationships that are desired or rejection of an intimate association. Okay, yeah, so it's just.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. I think the idea of the intimacy is really critical, but my comment was actually about the word hybridity has a sort of bioengineering connotation that I think is what separates it from fusion. Like, in a weird way, you talk about the switch from post-human to animal studies, and like cyborgs feel like more of a fusion than a hybrid. Does that make, do you see kind of the, and I'm not sure why I said that part, but part read longer, but I do think hybridity has that, because hybrid plants, I mean, hybridity has a long history of being used as for, yeah.
So I actually have been writing my keyword essay for Sam's class on cyborg, and it's very deeply connected to the post-human, of course, as a post-humanist theoretical space, but cyborg post-human essentially is the facilitated evolution through bio or technological engineering. And so the bioengineering would be something more so like the equisapient versus the technological facilitation would be something like a cyborg. However, the cyborg cannot be born of technology. So the connection to fusion would be so kind of like the idea in my head of like soldering technology into like actual flesh. But the interesting thing that I've noticed with cyborgs versus the racist use of animalizing Black people is that they kind of exist on this spectrum of deciding what is the most optimum form of human, where the animal is like the lowest level and the transcendent form of technology, which is obviously only accessible to the people who are the most wealthy, is at this upper end.
I don't actually know if this would be like up for this, but in thinking of like the face being obscured, sorry to bother you with that statements. And a lot of like high fantasy, like creatures that are human everywhere but the face are considered like demi-humans, but then creatures like centaurs and stuff are called humanoids. And I think that's a very interesting distinction to make. Just in that concept of like what is really human in that sense, and if when it comes to movies or films, like sorry to bother you with like the racial aspect, where does that distinction fall and why?
This might be, I was thinking about like, I don't remember if it's like Walker Becker, like the idea of aura, talking about photography, and he said the human face was like the thing that could not be like replicated in the same way as like it's like a piece of art or like a piece of writing or like a picture. But like there's something very startling about like an image of a human face. So that could be, maybe less applicable to like science fiction stuff.
One thing that seems really interesting that this, without the comes in this discussion, is the kind of the way that the equisapien or another figure of the kind of like partially human, partially non-human animal figure is that it seems to generate this like proliferation of terms, each of which has like a different set of associations, like fusion or hybrid, and then I'm also thinking like amalgamation, like the Tanya Bianco's first book, which I have heard originated in coursework in a keywords essay on the term amalgamation. So like, yeah, yeah, like I think it was like the Joseph Roach in the class. But like, so I think it would be productive to pursue, you know, all these different models for kind of like admixture and their their different relationships to race and species. Some of them, you know, they all have like slightly different resonances and different, you know, links to say like scientific fields and stuff. But then also at the same time, I feel like in the chapter and in the film, which I still haven't seen, I'm sorry, but that like in some ways, there's I recall, and in your writing that there's a kind of like, maybe, I don't know, something like I don't even know if it's even but like something like literal or something like non-discursive or a way in which like it feels like the set of terms you might bring to the situation each would kind of carry with it like a set of associations that are maybe relevant but not necessarily like active in the texture of the film. I'm guessing. So I guess like it's not really suggestive, I'm just like I'm wondering like going deep on say like hybridity, would that to what extent with like choosing one or even like investigating all these terms that have such like theoretical traditions behind them, like yeah, it's a totally just open question of like what would that do in the chapter. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah. Yes, that's a good.
Like I think it would do something, but I'm
Yeah.
which one?
Is that a hand, Joshua, or is that a thinking?
Just one quick thing, because I wanted to add to the array of terms. Chimera could also be interesting, right?
Which
Chimera, right? In part because a chimera, one is an actual sort of methodological creature on its own, but it's also an unrealizable dream, right? It's a kind of fabrication or a delusion. And I think that can be really interesting to sort of work with. What is the distance between the creature we see that's composed of many parts and this idea of an unrealizable dream? And as people were going around, it made me think that part of what Slaughterhouse Time does is that it takes away the face. Like it takes away the human face, it takes away our individuality and our sense of ethical relation with one another. Because it was something I was wrestling with going over the manuscript. It's like, all right, so what are the effects of Slaughterhouse Time? And I think that's one of them. It sort of flattens the vibrance of our remarkable interspecies, even intraspecies difference.
Yeah, for also the same butchery, it's taking off that.
Yeah, taking off the head and that reduction to parts. I'm gonna have to sit with a lot of these like really rich comments because I think part of what the disorientation mechanisms of Riley that precede even the Equisapiens are meant to kind of make us think in ways that are out of turn or out of to make us perceive things that are kind of out of sequence or out of joint or to perceive the kind of sound of a scene before we're dropped into its place. So I think all of these ways that Riley is trying to kind of get out of that industrial pace and rhythm happen kind of cinematically even before the revelation of the Equisapiens. And then once we get to this chimeric figure, this hybrid figure, whatever term that kind of comes to be is, I mean, it's both a use of, or like an amalgamation or a kind of impossible register that makes the metaphor actually materially realized, but it's happening in the kind of realm of something like a nightmare or the realm of the unconscious that cinema is able to kind of visualize. Yeah, super helpful comments. Yeah.
I am thinking,
Yeah, go for it.
let's see. I don't want us to leave this room without, just saying your readings are like, we should do it. I really, really enjoy the way you read some. From, yeah, you wanna pop in?
Right, from left field, this.
Oh, okay. All right, this will be really quick. And the intense reading that you give on like 36, 37, leading to the end, then opens you up for all of these questions on 38, which kind of remind me of what we're trying to talk about, like how you begin. Try to open up with these questions that and maybe a reading. Like take this seat. you know, and then work it from all the different, you know, one thing's great about animal study, the same scenes have been heard in like 30 books, right? So we all love to go back to the same scene and go, no, I'm gonna tweak it this way. And I think that's like what makes that philosophical moment rear its ugly head in animal studies, right? We all want to go back to this like, you know, Freudian get. But I think maybe since you're such a strong reader, bring us a scene that might be tweaked in all the different directions and might invoke the kinds of moves you want to make. And it doesn't have to be something that goes in the book. It also just be a pretty, you know, where you take something, but I just look at these questions. Or is this a physical altercation that might resemble Douglas's famous physical mastery over puppy? Or might this unscripted resolution offer an invitation? You are moving us to open up, you know, at this last moment. And then the last thing is Isaac Julian's Lessons of the Hour. I was fascinated with that entire film. And I had a chance to see it at the MFA. If you can find out where it's going to be, go see it. Okay. Because basically the horse is very, one of the most, it ends with the horse. The figure of Douglas on the horse begins to weave through the entire last part of it until finally they are together with a vision that is united, which is interesting, looking at the same collection. The meeting we write to Julian and say like, can we talk about horses? But I haven't gotten the courage to do so.
And is he a writer? Is he a writer? Okay, but like, does he also ride horses?
Oh,
Right.
Yeah. Right. I know that Percival Everett is a big rider. It's Western Farm. It's a ranch that keeps horses.
Which film?
This is an art installation, actually. It's a film that occurs. Have you seen it, Joshua? It's on 5 screens. Julian, it was curated by the fabulous his name I'm forgetting. The fabulous had a exhibitions at the and it's a 5 screens digitally produced about basically Frederick Douglass' speeches and his kind of public persona. There's a scene of his wife who was dressed in a complete, also just taking seamstress tailor. And also his lovers. I mean, it's intense. It's intense. Like it's the best 10 minutes I've ever spent. And so I think it's for sure.
It looks like it's up now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum until 2026.
Oh, yeah.
2026.
Wow, found a permanent place.
Yeah.
School doesn't have to travel.
3 years.
Definitely go see it. Yeah, it's worth it.
Daryl, I saw.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about Douglas and I apologize in advance because I read all of this very, very quickly. So I probably steamrolled over a lot of really good points that you were making. But one thing that in my conception of Douglas is that, especially in the narrative, but even in his other autobiographies, is that his main gambit is to basically try to create himself, of course, as a post-beast and also in some ways post-human, because Douglas, his triumph over Colby essentially means I can no longer really be enslaved because I have transcended slavery. It's the salvation narrative or the conversion narrative again, but it's this idea that he has somehow transcended slavery in mind and in terms of spirit, because he essentially will no longer experience slavery, which in his mind means having the body opened and experiencing pain. And this is where I think that for Douglas, becoming not just human, but something beyond human and the impossibility of becoming human is him creating this persona that no longer feels what he clearly felt when he was enslaved in his apostrophes and everything that he writes, but he becomes that 19th century ideal of the hero precisely because he does not feel. It's a very toxic sort of notion, as many people have already commented, in a lot of Douglas scholarship, that seems to be something that is very closely connected to what I see happening, especially in chapter 4. And when you're talking about, sorry to bother you in this, and the idea of becoming post-human, and what that entails. So I think that's one little way to bring in Douglas or talk about Douglas is that as important as a figure as he is into what you're doing, that aspect of him is what's most interesting and troubling about him at the same time, is his desire to somehow transcend his own body for the sake of becoming the heroic, or the 19th century hero.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I think the kind of wink and nod moment that precedes the fight with Cubby, where he takes the root, is a kind of invocation of this as kind of in the realm of potentially the supernatural, the magical, the mystical. And I think you're absolutely right. It's in some ways people have read it as a scene of a masculinist overcoming, but in other ways I think it's a kind of post-human mythical theme that he's kind of suggesting could have been invoked by something like ingestion of the root. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Daryl.
So I say one thing of the historian that transcendence and postness are very different, I think, ways of thinking of things. And to the extent that there's a question here, or you have a question about the sort of realizability of some kind of utopian future, that's an important difference.
Yeah, because transcendence has a really specific historical connotation in the 19th century.
And it's not a full, it's not, it had a different, it's not a modern conception of history, right? Which in post implies that we just kind of, a conception of progressive developmentalism.
Yeah, thank you.
Actually, most of the talks about Douglas and this notion of transcendence, there's also the opposite of like a very strong aesthetic within African American literature of the return to the noble African existence, which is pre-slavery and therefore more human. So kind of like reversal of that process.
Yeah. Is that a hand? I can't. Yeah. Yeah, I can't.
Sorry?
Is that a hand, Joshua, or is that a?
Oh no, I'm just thinking. I'm just ruminating.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all.
That was intentional, right?
I'm sorry.
Ruminating was an intentional.
Oh yeah, no man. Look, I thought about these things with Douglas for a long time, but I know we have limited kind of window. I'm gonna.
I know, right? So you mentioned Douglas with your voice, and then
And
everyone just was.
everyone's ready.
I know, right? Let's go.
Kind of weird. So I don't know if this would be like of much use to you, but I was thinking about this, especially like with the covering faces. But have you ever visited a cadaver lab?
No, strong no.
Often the when working with bodies, like they'll cover faces, sometimes even hands, because it's too personal. And I mean, yes.
Do you have access to a cadaver?
No, I in anatomy physiology we went into the cadaver lab, and but that might be like an interesting, this is how human bodies are processed after death.
It's also the funerary connections of like the coins over the eyes of the funeral shroud, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, like something about the non-expressive or animated face that's really like disruptive to our notion of what the human body is supposed to be or look like. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I know we're nearing the end, so yeah, if there are any last thoughts, but also this has been such a rich conversation. I can't thank you enough, Sharon and Joshua, for reading so carefully, brilliantly, and astutely, and for these really generous comments that I think will, I need to sit with, and I think they'll be really transformative of the whole manuscript. So thank you both so much. But yeah, any last comments, any last takers?
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, Joshua. We miss you here in Dallas, but I hope you'll get the chance at some point to make a trip down. And yeah, best to you and yours. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, thank you, Sharon. Good to see you.
Good seeing y'all.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Yeah, it's really exceptionally helpful comment. And
Thank you all for
really
sharing
thing. Yeah.
with us. It's just,
Hopefully it's
can be a
helpful.
part of finding out like
Yeah,
questions.
hopefully it's helpful for graduate students to see work before, you know, in its kind of like rough stages. Yeah, did you do one?
So you, great things that we had to do here, but I didn't, yeah.
Yeah.
One of my readers is actually at University of Arizona, so I was like, you know, so I met up with her. That's cool. And yeah, it was, yeah. Like.
Yeah, but to be able to, I think after you've been sitting with the project for so long, it's rare to kind of see it and to have people. And also,
I feel like.
yeah, like what,
You know,
and what not, and what to say.
parts of the research, I think to me, like,
Well, there's just one that varies.
No, but I'm actually.
And then.
You know, I didn't read the thing that doesn't exist, you know, like, because that wasn't the stuff that like. you care about.
Yeah.
I'm very fine with stuff, it's like.
Big identity.
I mean, already.
You need to know.
But like.
Not be resolved.
Like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Right, but it's like, that's, it's really.
Yeah.
We got.
Okay, wow.
This would be the side here.
Time feel like kind of. But this is like, not translator like that.
But also kind of thought about maybe like desire that might provide. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know.
Or like, it's all by its own trauma, or was it kind of like a combination of the work and also like being Polish?
No, it's quite.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
it's like,
yeah.
it's like something like that. Well, such a. That was kind of some. That they were like, it's years that it's not in here. So, and I was like, well,
Josh holds on to so much.
Yeah. And also, but it's like, you know, like Juan,
Yeah,
like
she gives
there's
us.
no- And it's like, so. I feel like, see, but there it's in, and it's like really kind of difference.
Narcissism had that. I'm going back and forth.
Like, yeah, like it was, yeah, it's like you, I mean, it was.
Listen,
Like, probably. Your lyrics scholars, they would be like. But like. Yeah.
I stopped studying that, like meaning I finished it,
Yeah.
the reread. I decided, actually, a lot of conversation last night, and then
little bit of different possibilities that I didn't benefit with it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I found, yeah, because I was just like, y'all don't make some trials times. You're not gonna understand that, but she was like, I understand if they took it away, and I'm really angry.
Yeah.
Like, let's go. And I was like,
Yeah.
I just. Yeah. And she had how I work with her, like, this is what I want to be. And so there's really, she had
And then in Mississippi. But like,
So you didn't like.
I think the department's very. Department's great. University. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Rich. It's all blur to me. Also, like, part of me is like, just walked out something. Yeah. But I'm, yeah, the, faculty and like, it's just very, it's like the closest thing. 2 hours of like, it's just that, but like,
So I was like, okay,
not-
maybe she'll say.
like, knowing myself, I wouldn't be in Memphis all the time. If it's like 2 hours, I'd be like, yeah.
I would.
Yeah, like even like a, it's like, okay,